It was a cold November night in Albany, New York, when I first realized something was terribly wrong. I've always been a light sleeper, the kind who wakes up at the slightest noise, so when I felt someone get into bed with me around midnight, I didn't think much of it. My partner had been out late with friends, and I just assumed he'd finally made it home. "Hey, how was your night?" I mumbled, still half asleep. No response. I figured he was just tired, so I rolled over and went back to sleep. The next morning, as I sat in the kitchen sipping my coffee, I asked why he didn't respond to me when he got home. He looked at me, puzzled, and said, "I didn't come home last night. I stayed at a friend's place because it was too late to drive." My blood ran cold. If he wasn't in bed with me, then who was? That realization hit me like a freight train. I spent the next few nights wide awake, terrified that the stranger might return. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I moved out of that house, but I never figured out who or what had shared my bed that night. During the summer of 2019, in Portland, Oregon, my son came home from the park. His face lit up with excitement as he talked about a new friend he'd met. He said they played a special game together called the Shadow Game. At first, I thought it was just another one of his imaginary friends, something harmless that all kids do. But as days passed, his behavior began to change. He became secretive, often whispering to himself when he thought I wasn't around. One night, I heard him talking in his room long after bedtime. Curious and a bit concerned, I peeked in to check on him. There he was, standing in front of the wall, staring at a shadow that seemed to move on its own. "Mom, my friend says you should play the Shadow Game with us," he whispered, turning to me with a grin that sent chills down my spine. I grabbed him and left the house that night. We never went back. Later, I discovered that years ago, a boy had died under mysterious circumstances in that very park. The thought of what could have happened if we had stayed still haunts me. Early in 2021, my wife and I moved into what we thought was our dream home, a quaint cottage nestled in the rural outskirts of Asheville, North Carolina. We were eager to start our new life in the peaceful countryside, away from the city's chaos. But our excitement quickly turned into unease when an elderly couple began visiting us, claiming to be the original owners of the house. At first, we didn't think much of it. They seemed friendly, even helpful. But their visits became more frequent and increasingly unsettling. They acted as though they still lived there, cooking in our kitchen, sitting in our favorite chairs, and even lying in our bed one night. When I confronted them, they simply smiled and said, "This is our home. We never left." Disturbed, my wife and I did some digging into the house's history. We found out that the couple had indeed owned the house, but they had died in a fire that destroyed the original structure years ago. They weren't alive, and yet they were still here, acting as if nothing had changed. We couldn't stay there any longer. We sold the house and moved far away. But even in our new home, I can't shake the feeling that they're still with us, watching, waiting for us to come back. It was early March 2023 in Denver, Colorado, and every morning, like clockwork, I would leave my house at 6:30 a.m. to catch the bus to work. But one morning, as I turned the corner onto my street, I saw a man standing on the sidewalk a little way ahead of me. He was swaying slightly, like he was lost in a trance. At first, I thought he was just another drunk, or someone who had had a rough night. But as I got closer, something about him seemed off. His movements were too erratic, too unnatural. Then he stopped swaying and turned to face me. His face was expressionless, his eyes empty, but he was staring right at me. I froze, fear tightening its grip on me. The man slowly raised his hand and pointed directly at me. Then, without warning, he bolted into a nearby alleyway. Shaken, I hurried to the bus stop, trying to brush off the encounter. But it was all I could think about. Every morning after that, he was there, standing in the same spot, always pointing at me. One day, I decided to confront him, but when I reached the corner, he was gone. Relieved, I continued to the bus stop. But as I passed the alley, I saw him, just standing there watching me. I never saw him again after that day, but the image of him pointing at me haunts me to this day. I can't help but feel that he's still out there, somewhere, waiting for me to pass by again. It was the winter of 2020 in Seattle, Washington, and I was still reeling from the sudden loss of my girlfriend in a tragic car accident. I spent weeks in a daze, drowning in grief, unable to accept that she was really gone. Then, one night, my phone buzzed with a text message from her number. It simply said, "I miss you." I stared at the screen in disbelief. At first, I thought it was some sick prank, but the messages kept coming, each one more personal than the last. They mentioned things that only she would know, details of conversations we had, places we'd been together, even private jokes. I was terrified, but I couldn't stop myself from responding. I needed to believe it was really her. As the messages continued, they became darker, asking me to join her. "Come to me," one message read. I didn't know what to do. The rational part of me knew she was gone, but the messages made it feel like she was still out there, somewhere, waiting for me. One night, the messages abruptly stopped. I thought it was over, but the silence only made things worse. The next morning, I was found in my apartment, phone in hand, a final message on the screen. "I'm waiting for you."